time to start talking about routers. Routers are another really important tool in a wood shop. They are incredibly versatile. You can mount them to a table, much like you saw when we did our mortising. And there are a variety of different sizes. Okay, we have like a 1 1/4 horse router. This is pretty standard size. We've got smaller trim routers, okay, meant for detail work or smaller work, and then you've got these big, gigantic 1 3/4 horse ones, okay, that are typically meant to be mounted into a table, but these things do quite a bit of work. And depending upon how you set them up, okay, these can be used to cut joinery. Okay, with specialized jigs, you can cut dovetails to create joinery. You can use straight bits and guides to create grooves and dados. They are really, really versatile. One of the other big reasons for using these things is to go ahead and put a decorative edge on your work. Right? You got a squared off board on the corners and you want to dress it up a little bit with some sort of profile. This is the machine to go ahead and do that. And if you have a variety of router bits, okay, you have the ability to go ahead and pick and choose what you'd like to use. Now these are just a quick smattering of router bits that we have in the shop here. There are a wide variety of router bits out there, sizes and shapes, but we have a simple chamfer bit, which is basically just going to clip the corner off of your workpiece. We have a round over bit here, okay, that's going to round the edge of your corner or your board over. We have something that's called an OG bit, not original gangster, okay, OG as in Roman OG. But this will cut kind of an S-shaped curve in your work, a little bit more decorative than the others. And then we have a cove bit, which is basically the inverse of a round over. So instead of rounding the edge over, it's going to dish out the corner and create a nice little scoop. Okay. We also have straight bits in a variety of shapes and sizes. Okay. These are going to typically be used to create joinery, grooves, dados, shiplap, okay, things like that. For this video, we're going to focus on the decorative router bits. All right. Now, if you look at a router bit, on these router bits specifically, you're going to notice that there is a little ball bearing at the tip. Okay, this ball bearing is called a pilot, and what its job is to do is to follow the edge of your workpiece, thus guiding the router bit straight along the edge of your work. If there was no bearing here, we'd have no way to really control how far in or out of the board we cut. So this bearing acts much like a fence does on the table saw or the router table. So let's take a second here, clear the deck, and I want to show you how to go ahead and set up a router, and we'll talk about the different base options that you have, and I'll show you how to load a router bit into the router and change your depth of cut. And then we'll talk a little bit about safety after that. So we'll get all this out of here and we'll talk about setting up the router. Setup. Okay, these are fairly simple machines in principle. However, setup tends to be a little bit of a tricky situation for a lot of new woodworkers. To start out with here, I've got two routers, same size routers, but they're obviously quite different. The router right here has got what's called a fixed base. The router over here has got what's called a plunge base. For setup, I'm going to show you how to set up the fixed base router just so you can see a little bit more clearly. But for operation, I'm going to switch over to the plunge base and show you how to adjust and operate one of these routers over here. So, when we go to set up a router, you're going to need a couple of things. Okay? You need your bit, and you're going to need a collet. Now the collet, if you look at the center, has got a hole running down the middle. We have two different size collets. We have a 1/4 inch collet and a 1/2 inch collet. The collet you choose has to fit the shank of the router bit. So this happens to be a 1/2 inch shanked router bit. So I obviously cannot fit that into the 1/4 inch collet, so I need to go to the 1/2 inch collet here for my setup here. So we'll move the 1/4 inch collet out of the way. Now the way the collet works is there's a nut on the top here. And this running through the middle of that nut is a sleeve, and that sleeve has got slits cut in it. And what happens is as I tighten the nut around the collet, those slots close down and squeeze around the circumference of the shank, holding the router bit in place. It's very secure as long as you set it up correct to start with. So the other thing we're going to need, a pair of router wrenches. Right? These are going to be used to go ahead and turn the collet nut and turn the armature nut or arbor nut on the router itself. So let's go ahead and set this up. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to unlock the fixed base by flipping this lever here, and then this just unscrews, right? And we'll put that off to the side. So now you can see there is a nut attached to the motor itself, and we have the nut for the collet. To start, okay, I'm going to thread the collet nut on 1 or 2 threads, just so that it's attached. My next step is to take the router bit, place it into the collet. It should slide right in. Now we don't want to force this all the way down, okay, but we also don't want it sticking way the heck up here. Right? If you look at the shank of a router bit, it's going to flare as it comes into the cutter. We want to stop just short of that flare, okay, so that we're clamping the collet along the straight portion of the router bit shank. Now the last thing we got to do here is tighten this up. So I'll start by tightening it by hand, and I'll tighten it as far as I can by hand. And now I'm going to use the router wrenches. Okay, and this is where people tend to get hung up. When you tighten a router or a router bit into a router, we want to think about only moving the collet nut. So I want to think about this bottom nut that's attached to the motor, keeping that in place. And then I want to use the wrenches to move the collet nut clockwise or counterclockwise, depending on what I'm doing. I'm tightening this, so I want to move this in a clockwise direction. So I'm going to set my router wrenches up and swing the top nut clockwise. Okay, I'm going to have to readjust here because it's not tight enough, but here is where we want to make sure we're kind of being a little safe. We want to push these 2 wrenches towards each other. Right? If you set yourself up like this and you're pushing with 2 hands and this slips, you're going to punch yourself in the knuckles and it's going to hurt. So what you want to do is try and do this one-handed or interlock your fingers, right, to squeeze these 2 together to tighten the router sufficiently. Okay? If you notice, these router wrenches, okay, are offset. So if I line them up with the nut, okay, the handles run opposite each other. That allows us to squeeze this in order to tighten this up. Okay, I cannot tell you how many times I've seen kids try and tighten this and this slips off and they bash themselves in the knuckles. So try and work safe, okay? Keep everything within 1 hand or 2 hands and tighten this up snugly. Last thing to do, load your fixed base back on and move this up or down to determine how much material is going to be cut. All right. Oftentimes we're going to want, maybe the entire profile of this router bit, okay, when we're done, but that is far too much material to cut at one time. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this up into smaller cuts and maybe only expose just a little bit of the router bit above the base. Make a pass, then we'll lower it, make another pass and lower it. But I'll show you that in operation a little bit more detail. But when you're happy with your height, you just lock this up and you should be ready to go ahead and route. All right, we're going to switch this over to a plunge base. We'll talk a little bit about safety and go ahead and cut a sample cut for you. Alrighty, I have switched over to a plunge base router, and we'll talk about more specifically how to set up a plunge base router for our cut later. What I want to do is talk about safety with the router right now. This is one of those machines that can be a little bit scary. It is incredibly loud, especially when you start cutting. And these motors, I know the ones that are set up on the router table spin at 21,000 RPM. And if you think about that for a second, that is incredibly fast. And when these motors turn on, they go to that RPM almost immediately. So when you hit the on switch, this thing goes from 0 RPM to like 15, 16, 17,000 RPM almost instantly. So they kick a little bit, and they can be a little bit unwieldy to control. So when we're using them, we have to be cognizant of the fact that we need to have complete control over this router the entire time. Now, a couple things that we want to think about before we even use a router is we want to check our cord, make sure there's no frays, splits, or anything cut or any wires exposed. Okay, that happens more than you'd think because the router bit runs out the bottom of the router, and sometimes these cords kind of get stuck up underneath there and they get chewed up. So check your cord, make sure the cord is good. If it's a 3-prong cord, make sure all 3 prongs are there. We want to make sure these are grounded in case something happens inside of here. The other thing we want to think about is when we operate this machine and it is on, we never, ever, ever take our hands off of it. Okay, so the on-off switch is up here. So when you hold this router, you want to position yourself in a place where you can hold the router and operate the on-off switch, okay, without having to move your hands around a lot. Okay, again, these things are spinning up really, really fast, and it is easy for you to lose control, especially if you're being timid with it. When we're using these things, right, if we're going to cut a board, right, the router goes onto the board. We make sure the router bit is not in contact with the board itself. Okay, then we turn the router on. Okay, we don't put this right up to the board and hit go, okay, because it's going to start cutting instantly and it's going to rip the router out of your hand. Okay, when you're done making your cut, okay, if I go all the way around this board, I come back to the beginning, I move my router off and I turn the machine off and I leave it there until it stops rotating. A lot of times what kids will do is they'll get in a rush, they'll come around and they'll flip this up this way. This thing, remember, is spinning at 15, 16,000 RPM, and I'm just swung that right towards myself. Okay? Even if you go this way, you run the risk of banging into something or somebody. So leave it here until that stops coasting. When it's done coasting, okay, it gets laid down on its side. Okay? We don't want to lay it upside down here and have the bit exposed, okay, for somebody to bump into it or whatever might happen by here. So always 2 hands, okay, always on its side, okay, unless of course we're setting up the router, okay, then you can have it upright while you're doing your setup. Okay, when you route, okay, to be safe, we want to make sure that if we're routing a board on the perimeter of the board, we move in a counterclockwise fashion. Gives us more control. We're feeding into the rotation, so the router bit wants to go that way, but we're going to make it go this way. That gives us more control. If we try and move it the same way the router wants to push itself, okay, it's going to scoot along, and we're going to lose control over the router that way. So on the perimeter of a board, counterclockwise. If we were routing the inside of a frame or a hole, we would go clockwise. But for most of the work you're going to do in here, we're going counterclockwise with the router. All right, so pretty basic safety. Biggest thing you got to remember is you have to be in control of this machine. You can't be afraid of it. Okay, you just hold on tight. If you keep the router base down, right, you should be pretty safe here. So let's get our board clamped down, and I'll show you how to go ahead and actually cut with this thing. All right, we're ready to go ahead and cut. I want to show you briefly how a plunge base is going to work. On a fixed base, we twist the base around, okay, to change the depth of cut. On a router, or plunge router, they have a lever which is attached to a spring. So if I pull this lever, I unlock the base and I can push this up and down, exposing more or less of the bit as I need. Okay, when I'm at a place where I like, you let go of the lever here, and it will hold itself in place that way. So setup is a little bit trickier on these because you're trying to dial in the right depth. It takes a little bit of work. but we'll try here. Now, before you set your depth of cut, there's a couple of things that you really got to remember, or at least one thing you really got to remember. That pilot on this router bit is what is going to make this router cut where we want it to. So anytime I'm going to route a board, okay, I have to make sure that that pilot is going to contact the board. Okay? If I have this plunge too far and that pilot is above the top of my board, there is nothing to keep me from pushing this board all the way through that router and cutting it in two pieces. So never exceed that pilot. Okay? Always got to have some material lined up against that pilot. All right, again, we mentioned earlier that if we want to take a full profile of a router bit, oftentimes we have to do it in multiple passes. Trying to take this much material off at once is way too much material. You're going to splinter your board, you're going to burn your board, and you're going to dull this router bit really badly. So I'm going to start maybe by exposing 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch worth of material on the router. So I've only got just a little bit sticking up here. I'm going to route this board right here. You have a couple options. We have some of these router mats, okay, or these rubber mats in the shop that will prevent this from moving. Or you can physically clamp the board down. You'll just have to route a little bit, unclamp it, turn it around, reclamp it, and go about that way. But for what I'm going to do here, I'm going to set this up on the mat, and it should be just fine. I'm going to make sure the router is off before I plug it in, and I'm going to go ahead and plug this in. And now, okay, I'm going to go around the outside. Remember, when we route the outside perimeter of a board, we're going to go counterclockwise. And when we go counterclockwise, there's a couple of rules we want to follow. We always want to cut the end grain before the preceding edge grain. Right? That way, what happens often when we come across the end grain, the router bit splinters all this corner out. If I've already routed this, I have no material left to clean up after that pass. So if I cut here and it blows this corner out, I still have all this to route, and that often will clean it up. So if I'm going to route, I'm either going to start in the upper left corner as I face the board, or the lower right corner, and I'm going to go counterclockwise. That way I'm always cutting the end grain before I cut the next edge grain. Now, to do this, router needs to stay firmly on the board. The router weighs enough to keep itself firmly down. Your job is to keep the pilot tight against the edge of the board as you're cutting, and move the router in that counterclockwise fashion. You don't need to push down on this. The weight of the router is more than enough to do it. So I'm going to start in this corner here, and I'm going to go counterclockwise. Remember, I'm going to hold the router in such a manner that I can access the on-off switch without having to move my hands around. Okay, I'm going to make sure the cord is out of the way so I don't accidentally run it over. Okay, I'm going to bring the bit off of the router, or excuse me, the board. I'm going to turn it on. I'm going to go in until my pilot contacts the board, and then I will begin to go around. When I get back to the beginning here, I will come off, turn the router off, and leave it there until that router stops moving. So this is going to be a little loud, so here we go. Okay, told you it was loud. Okay, so now I've gone all the way along and I've given myself a nice chamfer on the edge of my board. Okay, remember, you have to keep the pilot tight to the board. So as I'm going around here, I need to shift my pressure, okay, to go into the direction of the board, or that the direction the board is in, to keep everything tight. Now, if I wanted to cut more, I would simply lower the base on my router bit just a little bit more, right? And I would do the exact same thing again. Okay, make sure the cord's out of the way, make sure I'm holding it firmly, okay? In, around, out, off, leave it until it stops, and then set it down.